How to survive camping, the bad years. I run a private campground. I've lived on this land my whole life and I know it very well. I can recognize when something is wrong, when we have a pest infestation, when an incoming storm poses a risk to the campers, and when dead trees need to be pulled down before they fall on someone. I also am familiar with the other inhabitants here, one of which I told you about last time. Most importantly, I know the signs of a bad year, when something changes on the land and it begins to manifest itself in the earth and the sky. If you're new here, you should start at the beginning, and this might also help if you're lost. Early on in these posts I received a lot of questions about how many deaths we got at the campground. People were trying to figure out how we stayed open if we had people getting killed in horrible ways left and right. I've reassured people in the comments, but I should address it properly. Our numbers aren't actually that bad. My posts make it seem like I run Camp Sudden Demise, located in the scenic town of Murdersville, when in reality I am cherry-picking the worst incidents to tell you about across the span of, well, I've been running this campground for a bit over 15 years now, and then there's this stuff from my childhood and previous generations. Certainly, our death and injury count is slightly inflated from the surrounding areas, but we still average more mundane incidents than ones caused by our other inhabitants. Except during bad years. Our numbers can double or even triple during bad years. I track all of this because when trying to affect a change, there has to be some way to measure if what you're trying is having an impact. There are years from my childhood that feel like bad years because they stand out in my memories, fragments here and there, isolated incidents that I remember as being worse than the others. I'm not sure if they were truly bad years though, or if that is just a product of our faulty memories that lends significance but lacks rationality. I wish my parents had kept their own statistics. They didn't think they needed to. The police kept records. What more was needed? I've looked at the police records in an attempt to build a history. It's useless. We fake those reports, after all, and I can no longer tell which ones were altered. The theory of a bad year has been in my family for generations. It's intuition, a sense that the land is uneasy and that the inhabitants are restless. I was the first to solidify it with data, and sure enough, the early signs always precipitated a marked increase in deaths, disappearances, and injuries. Not just unnatural ones, either. Lots more broken legs or people with heat stroke in bad years. I rarely find a reason behind them. I think of them as weather patterns. Sometimes we have an abnormally cold winter and there's too many factors to point to any one thing as the cause. However, on one rare occurrence, I did discover why we were having a bad year. And I was able to stop it halfway through the summer. The first sign was a malaise in the trees. The new leaves sprouted late, and when they came, they were withered and shrunken and quickly dissolved into a wet mass, the dying buds coated with pale green sludge. I hired an arborist to inspect the trees, thinking perhaps I had some kind of disease spreading through the forest. I don't assume everything bad that happens here is unnatural. A lot of the time it isn't. The arborist was a college-educated redneck. He showed up looking like a cowboy that had left his gun and hat at home, with flared jeans over his boots and a shiny belt buckle. I led him out to the woods and showed him the leaves. He checked a couple trees and then got out a pocket knife and pried some of the bark off on one of the oaks. Small black shapes skittered out of sight, vanishing under the remaining bark in a heartbeat. "The hell?" the man muttered. "Were those beetles?" He asked if he could hike through the rest of the property and check some other locations. He'd swing by my office when he was done to discuss possible treatment options. "The trees were clearly ailing," he said. "The leaves should be unfurling by now. Probably a pest problem, if those things under the bark were any indication." I agreed and went back to my office to check my budget and see how much was currently set aside to deal with these sorts of land management issues. I never saw him again. After a few hours had passed, I went outside to find him. His car was still parked in my driveway. I radioed the rest of the staff and asked them to keep an eye out for the arborist, make sure he hadn't gotten lost. Then once it got close to sundown, I decided that something had happened to him. He hadn't been given a copy of the rules. Visitors during the sunlight hours are typically safe. They're not here long enough to attract anything's attention unless they're really, really unlucky. I had Brian bring the dogs around and let them sniff all over the interior of his pickup cab and then set them loose into the forest. They meandered around a bit, got distracted by squirrels a couple times, they're not actually trained for tracking, and eventually stumbled upon a patch of lush moss. This was a little unusual, as this is not a forest where moss typically grows on the floor in large patches. Not the right environment for it. What was further alarming was how the dogs reacted. They growled at it. Their hackles were up and they circled it, keeping a wary distance, teeth showing. I got a stick and poked at the moss, lifting one end, and thin white tendrils like hair dangled from the underside. The sunlight caught on something buried in its mass. I scraped at the object, dragging it out with my stick. A large shiny belt buckle. That was the second sign. After that, I began to see increased activity from all the permanent residents of my campground. The man with the skull cup was anxious to share his drink with people, and with enough offers, someone was bound to refuse, and so he killed that person. The dancers killed someone, and since they seemed to enjoy messing with me, they tacked his flayed skin to the outside of my bedroom window so I got to hear his screams and the flapping of the skin against the glass, on top of the little girls sobbing all night. I drank rather heavily and was still drunk by the time morning came, and I could burn the man's skin and put him to rest for good. Even the man with no shadow, who normally kept to himself because the bastard was working on his master plan, good riddance to that, got in on the fun and ordered a camper to go try to set the beast on fire with a homemade Molotov cocktail. That ended poorly and the man was torn to shreds, literal shreds. I picked about a sandwich baggie full of bone bits out of my yard before I gave up, by the beast, which didn't seem to give a damn that it was actively on fire while it did so. Yes, I know it was the man with no shadow because I asked if it was him when I saw him next, and he said he got bored. I'm going to assume he was telling the truth because I'm so tired of trying to figure out all the connections between everything he did, especially now that he's gone. So after a bit of that, I was at my wit's end on what to do about the campground. Even the town was starting to be affected as crops failed early and someone's field mysteriously flooded from a spring that has never shown itself again. The water stunk, too. It was like an open sewer, the water mud green with algae, and black insects like beetles crawled under the surface. Clearly, whatever was causing this bad year, its influence was spreading. I convened the family and we agreed, we couldn't weather it out this time. The trees, we thought. It started with the trees. We worked systematically. I drew a grid over the campground map and to each section we allocated a remedy. We tied charms and significant herbs to trees, batch by batch, to see which actually worked. We applied potions and concoctions to the bark and to the earth around the trees. I consulted with the lady with extra eyes and she sadly told me there was no remedy in her power that would work here. We even tried sacrifice in one section, each family member opening a minor vein until we had enough to water the trees with our own blood. None of it worked. By the time we admitted defeat on that angle, it was getting close to the biggest camping event of the year. I was frantic. We'd already collected money and paid for the additional services we had to bring in, the ice truck, the porta potties, etc. The town was anxious for the tremendous infusion of cash that the event would bring. We make a lot of money from the big events, and that pressure was certainly hanging over my head when I made the decision to keep the camp open for the summer. At that time, I'd hoped that we'd find something that would work. Well, we didn't, and I almost stopped eating from anxiety as the start of the event drew near. I hired additional staff, locals who knew the campground and how to survive it. I printed additional copies of the rules and had them added to the booklet the campers would get when they arrived on site. Normally it just has the map and the schedule and stuff specific to the event, but I hoped that a reminder on the rules would ease the burden on my staff for keeping everyone safe. Then, a day before the first campers arrived for the event, one of my staff went to the hospital. I didn't pay much attention at first, as they'd left for the ER from their own home, and so I assumed it was some mundane medical issue. One of the seasonal workers we bring in for the summer. His mother called me that evening, crying inconsolably. She was going to lose her boy, she said. The doctors thought that it was some kind of mold that he'd inhaled, but it had settled in his lungs and then grew, and now his chest was full of it. They hadn't even been able to put in a breathing tube because it was in his throat now, and when they'd pulled some out, trying to clear the passageway, what came out were clumps and clumps of moss. He died a few hours later. The moss put out tendrils that punctured the organ's walls, and the person that did the autopsy was hard-pressed to say which killed him first, suffocation or bleeding. Not that it mattered to his poor mother. He was dead. I told my staff to identify the moss and isolate it. Circle them with the pink spray paint we used to mark poison ivy patches. Keep the campers away from them. And then I braced myself for the biggest event of the year, when the population of my campground explodes with people. The day before the event opens is reserved for camp representatives. They show up early and mark out where all the tents will go, and I spend a lot of my time running around trying to resolve land squabbles. And sure enough, I got called out to the senior camp near the thing in the dark like I do every year to argue about that slope at the fore of their camp, which I swear is not as steep as they say it is, and it could totally work if they just got a little creative with their layout. However, when I arrived, my arguments mentally readied. I found the camp representative standing out by the thing in the dark stand. The trees had successfully put out leaves by now, but they were thin and tattered and hung limply from their branches. The bark was peeling off, and those dark insects could be seen moving in the gaps. Some of the trees had already died, and we'd cut them up and burned them. I'd grown used to the ragged appearance of the forest, the trees dark with malaise. The thing in the dark's mound, however, was a surprise. Normally the pile of branches and leaves look fresh, like they'd just been piled there a handful of days ago. Today, however, the leaves were a rotting mound, and the branches sagged inwards, collapsing under the weight of their own decay. Trash clung to the branches, blown there by the wind, and I realized that I'd never seen trash stuck to the mound before now. "I think it's still asleep," she said as I approached. "How do you know?" I asked. "Just a feeling. Something feels off. And look." She pointed. At the top of the mound was a soft, billowing carpet of moss. "Is it sick? Or maybe some kind of parasite?" the camper asked. "I have no idea," I replied. "It's certainly not how it's supposed to be, so I'll just go get a rake, I guess." The senior camp is smart. The representative conveniently found a reason to be elsewhere while I tore off all the moss. I wore a mask to protect myself and shoveled all of it into a trash bag. Then I tied the bag shut, and I'm glad I did. Because as I stood there catching my breath, the bag started to writhe. It bulged in one spot, then rippled, and bulged again. The plastic surface bubbled like it contained boiling water. I got another trash bag out and double-bagged it, just in case. Then I took it back to the house and radioed my staff that we were going to try something drastic. I wanted them to collect all the moss patches they'd identified, collect them very carefully, and bring them back to the house. Then I got some cans of gasoline out of the garage and settled on the porch to wait. The bag continued to move and slowly a pattern developed. It rippled back and forth, testing one end and then the other. Like it was trying to escape. So I went over there and beat the shit out of the bag with the rake, and its struggles subsided for a little bit, and eventually my staff returned with their own writhing bags of moss. We split the bags open and threw the moss into the bonfire pit. Then we poured gasoline onto it and it bubbled and pulled away from the liquid, but there was nowhere to go, and when it was good unsoaked I lit a branch and tossed it in. Well, it turns out that we didn't find all the patches of moss. Fortunately, while myself and the majority of the staff were focused on watching it burn in the pit, curling up and blackening inside the inferno, the camp representatives already on site noticed the smoke coming from other parts of the woods and called 911. The fires didn't spread too far before we got them doused, thank goodness. It had rained recently. So that convinced me that we'd taken out the whole thing. That. And one of my contacts at the hospital told me later that the boy's body had burst into flames. They didn't realize it right away, just the alarm sounded and the sprinklers went off, and when the fire department inspected the building they found that one of the drawers in the morgue was blackened and the body inside had been reduced to ash and the intensity of the flame. They chalked the cause of the fire up to spontaneous human combustion, and no one really wanted to contest that theory. That night we had another storm. The wind started up shortly after sunset and continued all through the night, causing considerable damage to the town. I sent my staff out into the storm to collect the camp representatives and we housed them in the barn. Thankfully, since the event had not yet started, we had enough room for everyone inside. Most of the people in town had damage to their roofs. My own house lost some shingles. There were downspouts knocked loose, tree branches fell on things, and the flooded field was emptied of water. The owner said that it was like the wind came and scooped it up, funneling it back into the sky like a tornado that hit only that spot, and then it was gone and the field was left with a thin layer of algae that quickly dried up in the sunlight the next day. My forest was cleared of leaves. All those thin, struggling leaves were ripped free by the wind and carried off to land somewhere far, far away. I often wonder what happened to the place where they landed. Perhaps it was nothing. Perhaps they never landed and the sky ate them up. I never found out. I just spent a sleepless night in the barn, watching the wind and the lightning through one of the few windows, and in the morning we emerged to a barren forest. The trees recovered. It was like a second spring. The campers arrived for their event and my land was bustling with people, and despite all my fears, we had only the average number of accidents. And the thing in the dark woke up. Halfway through the event I had a frightened man show up at the camp office. He was a bit older than me and paced back and forth, not able to even sit down in the chair in front of my desk in his agitation. He swore he thought he'd seen it all already and that my list of rules was just some funny little joke. He'd read them over and thought they were very clever. But last night, he said, the solars went out at 11 p.m., way too early. And he'd stayed in his tent, gripped by a sudden sense of unease that he'd learned to listen to, and something passed by. Something immense. Something powerful. Like nothing he'd ever experienced before. And I just nodded and said yes, that was rule number 10, and I'm glad he remained in his tent as he was supposed to. Then I assured him that he was quite safe, but if he wanted to cut his stay short I would be glad to issue a refund for the remaining days. He refused. I kept track of his name, out of curiosity. He's come back every year since. I wonder if he wants to know more about this land, much like all of you do. I'm a campground manager. I'm telling you all of this because, as I mentioned in my last post, the signs are still occurring even with the man with no shadow gone. If he were the cause, we shouldn't be seeing the signs. I wonder if he was a symptom of the bad year, and if so, that means there's more to come. I haven't cancelled events yet. It remains to be seen how aggressive it's going to be and how dangerous the forest will become. It's not as bad as the year with the moss, the forest itself remains unaffected. I'm going to keep watching and waiting, and then I'll be able to make a decision on what to do. And I'm going to keep looking for a